Welcome everyone to our deep dive into the world of Castlevania, Lament of Innocence. I think it's safe to say we're all pretty big fans of this series here.
Huge fans.
But Lament of Innocence, well, it doesn't always get the same love as some of the other titles, does it? Maybe it's because it's a prequel?
Could be. It definitely shakes things up a bit.
Yeah, and it's one of those games that once you really dig into it, you realize there's way more going on than just whips and vampires.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, it lays the groundwork for the whole Castlevania saga. We're talking about the very first Belmont to go up against Dracula.
And it's not just about that first encounter. It's about the why. What leads to this eternal conflict? What are the human stakes behind this whole supernatural war?
Okay, so let's break it down. We're in the year 1094. Our hero is Leon Belmont, a noble knight, totally head over heels in love with a woman named Sarah.
And of course, things can't just be happy and peaceful.
Right, of course not. Enter Walter Bernhardt, a powerful vampire who decides to kidnap Sarah. But he's not just lurking in some random crypt.
No, Walter's got style. He sets up shop in a castle. A seriously creepy castle in the Forest of Eternal Night. It's got the classic Castlevania gothic horror vibe going on big time.
Oh man, I bet that place is a nightmare.
Yeah.
So Leon, obviously, he's not just going to sit around. He sets off to rescue Sarah. But knowing Castlevania, it's not going to be easy.
Not at all. It's traps, monsters, puzzles, the whole works. But there's a twist. This is the first time the series went 3D.
Oh, right. I remember that being a big deal back in the day. How did fans react to that shift?
It was mixed. Some players loved it, the dynamic camera angles, the faster-paced action. It all felt fresh.
I can see that.
But some diehard fans of those 2D classics, they weren't so sure. They felt like the 3D, it took away from the precise platforming and exploration that made the series so unique.
Right. I get that. Those old-school Castlevania games, you could map out every pixel, master every jump.
Exactly. It was like a dance.
Yeah.
And some players felt that Lament of Innocence was more, more of a brawler.
Interesting. So you're used to those tight 2D environments, and suddenly you're in this open 3D world. That must have felt pretty different.
It was a big change, for sure.
Okay, back to Leon's mission. He's going up against a castle full of monsters. What's he packing? What kind of weapons and abilities does he have?
Well, he's got his trusty whip.
Of course, the whip.
Which, spoiler alert, will eventually become the legendary vampire killer.
Oh, right. It all starts here.
But it's not just the whip. He's got sub-weapons, too, like throwing axes, holy water, even a crucifix that acts like a boomerang.
So that classic Castlevania weapon variety is still there. That's cool. But how does it all work in 3D? Is it more action-heavy, or is there still that need for, like, strategic timing and planning?
I'd say it leans more towards action. It's fast. Lots of combos, juggling enemies in the air, dodging attacks, almost like a gothic Devil May Cry.
Oh, okay, I see that.
But don't get me wrong, you still need a good strategy, especially when you're facing those big bosses.
Speaking of classic Castlevania elements, we got to talk about the music.
Mm-hmm.
The series is famous for its amazing soundtracks. Does Lament of Innocence live up to that?
The music is good. It really is. But honestly, it maybe doesn't quite reach the same heights as, say, Symphony of the Night. That soundtrack is iconic. What do you think?
It's tricky. I remember when I first heard it, I wasn't sure. It felt different. But it definitely grew on me. There's this, underlying sadness to the music, especially Leon's theme. It fits his story so well.
You're right. When you consider the sacrifices he ends up making, that music, it just hits you differently.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about that. How does Leon's whip become the vampire killer? It's not just some random power-up, is it?
No way. It's actually a really tragic story. So Leon meets this alchemist, Ronaldo Gandolfi. Ronaldo helps him out, gives him advice.
Okay.
And Ronaldo tells Leon that to defeat Walter, to really fight the forces of darkness, he needs a weapon infused with serious power. And to create a weapon like that, you need a special ingredient, a pure soul.
A pure soul? Man, this is Castlevania. This isn't going to end well, is it?
Sadly, no. Remember Sarah? Well, she's not just stuck in the castle. She's slowly being turned into a vampire.
Oh, no.
So Leon, he's faced with this horrible choice. Save his love or sacrifice her to get the power he needs to defeat evil.
Wow, that's heavy. So is there another way? Does he find a loophole?
Well, this is where Sarah steps up. She knows what's happening to her, and she willingly offers her soul to empower Leon's whip. It's heartbreaking. That's how the whip becomes the vampire killer.
Wow. I can see how that event, that sacrifice, would shape the whole Belmont clan's history.
It does. It sets the stage for the future. It shows that being a hero, being a Belmont, it comes at a cost. a personal cost.
Okay, so Leon, he's got the vampire killer now. What happens when he finally faces Walter?
It's a classic Castlevania showdown full of gothic horror and intense action. Walter's no pushover. He's got all these vampire powers, and honestly, his backstory is pretty tragic too. But in the end, Leon wins. But
Mhm.
then there's another twist, a big one.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. What happens?
Leon thinks it's over. He's defeated Walter. Well, sort of rescued Sarah. And then Matthias shows up. He's a close friend of Leon and Sarah's, and he drops a bombshell. He planned the whole thing. He convinced Walter to kidnap Sarah.
Wait, what? Why would he do that?
Revenge. Matthias blames God for his wife's death. He believes God abandoned him, and now he wants to punish the world for it.
Okay, so he's the real bad guy here. He was pulling the strings all along.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. Fueled by all the chaos he's created, Matthias reveals his true identity. He becomes Dracula.
No way. This is how Dracula's born. Right here.
This is it. The catalyst for the whole Castlevania saga. This one act of betrayal, this fall from grace, it sets up the eternal fight between the Belmonts and Dracula. Centuries of conflict, all stemming from this.
This is incredible. Okay, we've got to dive deeper into all of this, but first let's talk about the game itself. The castle is more than just a backdrop, right? It's full of secrets, hidden areas, weird stuff you might miss on your first playthrough.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Like what kind of stuff? Give me an example.
Well, there's this whole hidden area called the Ghostly Theater. You got to face off against a succubus there. Pretty intense.
And wait, is there also like a skeletal roller coaster somewhere in the castle?
You heard about that, huh? Yeah, it's in the Dark Palace of Waterfalls, and it's as wild as it sounds. Pure Castlevania craziness.
Okay, this is blowing my mind. So we've got this massive castle. It's full of secrets and surprises. And then there are all these monsters lurking around every corner.
Oh yeah, tons of them. From creepy crawlies to skeletal warriors to, well, let's just say some of them are pretty hard to describe.
I bet. And the bosses, they got to be epic, right?
They are. Every boss is a challenge. You might face Medusa with her petrifying gaze, a giant undead parasite, or even this powerful vampire named Joachim. He's got his own whole story going on.
It sounds awesome. But let's say I beat the main story. Is there a reason to go back? Anything for those hardcore players who want more?
Oh, for sure. There are multiple difficulty levels. You can unlock characters like Joachim and play as them. And then, well, there's the pumpkin mode.
Pumpkin mode? What in the world is that?
You play as a pumpkin. It's as ridiculous as it sounds, but it's so much fun.
Okay, Castlevania never disappoints. So you've got these unlockable characters, secret areas, all these extra modes. It really rewards you for exploring, doesn't it?
It does. It's like the developers wanted to make sure you had a reason to keep coming back for more.
So we've got this game that establishes the whole Dracula versus Belmont conflict. It's got this amazing 3D castle full of secrets and monsters, and it rewards you for digging deeper. But how does it all connect to the larger Castlevania timeline? How does Lament of Innocence shape the games that come after it?
Well, it's important to remember that Lament of Innocence wasn't just about showing us that first Belmont fighting Dracula. It was about setting the stage for this whole ongoing war. It established the themes that echo throughout the series.
Give me an example. How does something in Lament of Innocence directly influence the things we see in later Castlevania games?
Well, for one, we see the birth of the vampire killer. This isn't just any whip, it's the symbol of the Belmont family's legacy, their fight against darkness. It shows up again and again in the series.
So we're seeing the origin of that legendary weapon, the one that gets passed down through generations of vampire hunters.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just the weapon itself. Lament of Innocence introduces this idea of sacrifice within the Belmont family. Leon's choice to use Sarah's soul, that sets the pattern. Future Belmonts, they're going to face similar choices. They're going to experience similar loss. It's almost like a curse that comes with the territory.
It's like this tragic fate that's built into being a Belmont. They're destined to fight Dracula, but it always comes at a price.
Exactly. Lament of Innocence lays the foundation for that whole idea. And future Castlevania games, they're going to explore that even more.
Man, I am so ready to talk about those other games and how they connect back to this one. But I think we should save that for later. We've covered a lot of ground here, but there's still so much to unpack about Lament of Innocence, especially when it comes to how it was received when it came out and how it compares to the rest of the Castlevania franchise.
You're right. We've only scratched the surface.
So buckle up, listeners. Our deep dive into Castlevania, Lament of Innocence, is just getting started.
So you mentioned wanting to get into how the game was received, and you know how it stacks up against other Castlevania titles. It's interesting how Lament of Innocence It's a good game, but it sparks a lot of debate among fans.
Yeah, it's true. Some people see it as like a hidden gem, and others are, well, let's just say they're not as enthusiastic.
It really depends on how you look at it. Remember, this was 2003. A lot of game franchises were trying to figure out that jump to 3D.
Right, some games totally nailed it, and others just felt kind of clunky.
Yeah. And Castlevania fans, especially those who were really into those 2D classics, they had high hopes. Some felt like Lament of Innocence looked amazing, but it didn't quite capture the magic of those super well-designed interconnected worlds.
So it's not just about the graphics then. It's about how the gameplay actually feels in 3D.
Yeah, in a 2D Castlevania game, you could like memorize every single pixel, every enemy placement. You could
Okay.
master the controls and the levels perfectly.
Right.
But in 3D, with a camera that moves around more and those open environments, that sense of precision was kind of lost sometimes.
That's an interesting point, because I could see how if you were a player who loved that 2D precision platforming,
Hmm.
Lament of Innocence might have felt kind of off, like you were trading accuracy for more of an action-heavy experience.
Exactly. And that's where some of the criticism comes from. Some players miss that feeling of carefully exploring every little corner, finding secrets with perfect jumps and whip swings. In Lament of Innocence, you still explore, but it's a little more straightforward.
So if I'm coming from like Symphony of the Night and I expect that same kind of level design in Lament of Innocence, I might be kind of let down.
It's possible, but there's another side to this coin, too. Some players really love the changes that Lament of Innocence made. The combat is way more dynamic and combo focused. It's faster. It's got that in-your-face feel.
Okay, I can see that.
Mhm.
So for players who are all about the action, Lament of Innocence offers a different kind of fun.
Right. It depends what you're looking for. And I think we have to give Lament of Innocence credit for trying something new, trying to push the series in a new direction. It paved the way for later 3D Castlevania games like Curse of Darkness, which took a lot of ideas from Lament of Innocence and expanded on them.
Let's talk about Curse of Darkness for a second. That's the direct sequel to Lament of Innocence, right? Did it try to fix any of the problems that players had with the first 3D game?
In some ways it did. Curse of Darkness has a much bigger world to explore, and it introduces this cool new gameplay mechanic called the Innocent Devil system.
Okay, what's that? What are innocent devils?
They're like these demon creatures that Hector, the main character, can summon and control. Each innocent devil has its own special abilities and fighting style. So instead of just using your whip and sub-weapons, you're managing this little army of demons.
So there's more strategy and customization in Curse of Darkness.
Definitely. You choose which devils to evolve, you train them to learn new skills, you can even combine them to create even stronger ones.
So it sounds like Curse of Darkness tried to innovate and add more depth to the 3D Castlevania formula.
Yeah, and it did a good job of addressing some of the complaints that people had about Lament of Innocence, especially when it comes to making the gameplay more complex and giving you more options.
You keep mentioning how Lament of Innocence pushed the series forward, but did it actually inspire any specific changes or features that we see in later Castlevania games?
Totally. For example, that whole thing with the whip evolving and gaining new powers that started in Lament of Innocence, and you see it again in games like Castlevania, Lords of Shadow, and that deeper look into Dracula's origin story, his motivations, his humanity, that became really important in the later games.
So in a way, Lament of Innocence planted the seeds for both narrative and gameplay ideas that really blossomed in those later Castlevania games.
Absolutely. It was this bridge between the classic 2D era and the more modern 3D era. It wasn't always a smooth transition. And yeah, there was some criticism, but this game, it took risks, it tried something different, and in the end, it really helped shape the future of Castlevania.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that's always fascinated me, the little details and secrets that developers hide in games. Lament of Innocence has its fair share, right?
Right.
What are some things that players might completely miss if they're not paying attention?
Oh, Lament of Innocence is packed with little nods, Easter eggs, hidden stuff, just waiting to be discovered. For example, if you really look around the castle, there are these little details. Books on shelves, paintings on the walls, even the way the castle is built. They all tell a story if you know where to look.
So it's like the game world is revealing its history and its secrets through these subtle hints.
Exactly. You might find an old book that mentions a character or event from a previous Castlevania game. Or you might notice a certain symbol or style of architecture that tells you something about the castle's origins.
It sounds like the developers really put a lot of thought into crafting this world, beyond just the main story and objectives.
They did. And for players who like to explore and pay attention, there are some really cool rewards. You might find a secret passage that leads to a powerful weapon or a hidden room that plays a classic Castlevania tune.
I love that. It's like the game is saying, hey, thanks for being curious. Thanks for noticing the little things. Okay, what's the coolest secret you've found in Lament of Innocence?
Ooh, that's a hard one. There are so many. But one that sticks out is this hidden music box in the House of Sacred Remains. It plays this haunting version of Bloody Tears, one of the most famous tracks from Castlevania 2. Simon's Quest. Finding that music box, it was like finding a piece of Castlevania history hidden away in this 3D world.
That's awesome. I love those connections to the older games. It's those little touches that make you feel like you're part of something bigger.
Yeah,
Okay, we've got to talk about the enemies and bosses in Lament of Innocence. It wouldn't be Castlevania without some seriously cool monster designs and epic fights, right?
you're absolutely right. Lament of Innocence doesn't disappoint in that department.
Okay, give me a picture. What are some of the coolest enemies or bosses that players should look out for?
Well, of course, you've got your classic Castlevania creatures, skeletal knights, werewolves with axes, those creepy skull-headed things that patrol the halls.
Right, got to have those familiar faces.
Yeah.
But I'm sure Lament of Innocence throws in some new and terrifying creatures too, just to keep things interesting.
Oh, yeah, definitely. One of the most memorable early encounters is with this giant, grotesque tapeworm thing in the House of Sacred Remains. It's really something else. And it definitely sets the tone for the kind of horrors you're going to face in the castle.
Okay, that sounds disturbing, but also pretty creative. How about the boss battles? Those are always a highlight in Castlevania games. Does Lament of Innocence deliver on the epic showdowns?
It does. The boss battles are amazing.
Hmm.
Each boss has its own unique attacks, weaknesses, and even a backstory that makes the fight more interesting.
Give me some examples. What bosses really stand out for you?
Well, Medusa is an early boss. She's a classic Castlevania enemy, but she's even more terrifying in 3D. You gotta watch out for her petrifying gaze, and her snake hair attacks can be tough to dodge.
Sounds like a classic Castlevania boss fight. Figure out the attack patterns, time your moves, right? Use your sub-weapons strategically.
Exactly. And then there's the undead parasite, this giant fleshy thing that fills the whole room with poison gas. It's a visually stunning fight, and it's really challenging. It makes you think on your feet.
So it's not just about dodging attacks. It's about using the environment to your advantage and managing your resources.
Right. And of course, there's the final showdown with Matthias. That fight is epic, and it's full of emotion.
Yeah, knowing that he's the mastermind behind everything, that he's going to become Dracula, that must add a whole other level of intensity to that fight.
For sure. It's a battle that pushes you to your limits.
Hmm.
And it has consequences that affect not just Leon, but the entire Castlevania timeline.
And I love that Lament of Innocence brings back those classic Castlevania sub-weapons. You mentioned the axe, the holy water, the crucifix. How do those work in the 3D combat system?
They work pretty much like they did in the 2D games. They give you ranged attacks, area of effect damage ways to exploit an enemy's weakness.
So it's not just about whipping everything in sight. You have to be strategic and use the right tool for the job.
Yep. And each sub-weapon can be upgraded too, which makes them even more powerful and versatile. So you can really customize your playstyle.
I always loved experimenting with different sub-weapons in Castlevania games. It's satisfying to find the perfect combo for a specific enemy or boss. Okay, so we've talked about the main game, the secrets, the enemies, the bosses. What about the really hardcore players? Does Lament of Innocence have anything for people who want a truly brutal challenge?
Oh, yeah. There's this hidden optional boss called the Forgotten One. It's this massive, terrifying monster that was actually considered too hard to be in the main game.
Wow, they had to tone it down. That's saying something. What makes this boss so tough?
Well, for one thing, it's huge. And it has these crazy attacks that can kill you in one hit. It's a real test of your skills.
Yeah.
And if you manage to beat it, you unlock some cool stuff like a boss rush mode where you can fight all the game's bosses one after another.
Okay. The Forgotten One is definitely going on my to-do list. That sounds like the ultimate Castlevania challenge. But before we wrap up this section, I want to go back to something we were talking about before. The criticisms of Lament of Innocence. Some players loved the changes it brought to the series, but others thought it strayed too far from the 2D formula. Looking back now, how do you feel about those criticisms?
It's complicated. I think it's fair to say that Lament of Innocence wasn't a perfect 3D Castlevania game. It had some issues like the camera controls and the level design being a little bit simpler.
Right, we talked about how some players missed those huge interconnected worlds that the 2D games were known for.
Yeah, but it's also important to remember when this game came out. It was a time when a lot of franchises were experimenting with 3D force. Lament of Innocence was brave for trying to bring Castlevania into that 3D world.
And it's easy to criticize a game looking back, right? Now we can see what worked and what didn't.
Exactly. And Lament of Innocence laid the groundwork for those future 3D Castlevania games. the ones that learn from both the good and the bad.
So even though it wasn't perfect, it was a necessary step in the evolution of the series.
Exactly. And I think over time, Lament of Innocence has actually gained more appreciation from fans. It's a flawed game, but it's ambitious. It dared to be different,
Hmm,
and it really helped shape the future of Castlevania.
I like that perspective. Okay, now I really want to hear your thoughts on how Lament of Innocence fits into the whole Castlevania timeline and how it influenced the games that came after it.
Well, one of the most obvious connections is the establishment of the Belmont clan as this line of vampire hunters. They're destined to battle Dracula across generations.
Right. Lament of Innocence introduces us to the very first Belmont to fight Dracula, which sets up centuries of conflict.
And the game sets up this recurring theme of sacrifice within the Belmont family. Leon's decision to use Sarah's soul that sets a precedent for the future Belmonts. They often have to make difficult choices and face personal tragedies in their fight against evil.
It's like this heroic legacy comes with a huge price.
Exactly. And this theme is explored even more in later games. It adds a layer of complexity and emotional depth to the overall story.
Okay, we've talked about how Lament of Innocence shaped the Castlevania series, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the game's critical reception. I know you mentioned that it got pretty good reviews when it came out, but it seems like some fans weren't as happy.
That's true. Critics liked the game's visuals, atmosphere, and combat, but some longtime Castlevania fans felt like the move to 3D wasn't completely successful.
What were their main issues? Was it just that they preferred the classic 2D style?
Well, that was part of it, but there were other concerns too. Some people felt like the 3D environments, even though they looked impressive, didn't have the same level of complex level design and exploration as the classic Metroidvania titles.
I get that. The 2D Castlevania games were known for their huge maps and interconnected areas that you gradually unlocked as you got new abilities. It's hard to recreate that in 3D.
Totally. And while Lament of Innocence does a decent job of bringing some of those elements into 3D, it doesn't quite have that same sense of seamless exploration and discovery.
Another thing I've heard from fans is that the story in Lament of Innocence felt a little too straightforward compared to the more complex stories in later games.
That's a fair point. The story of Leon and Sarah is emotional and impactful, but it's definitely more streamlined compared to the sprawling storylines and complicated character relationships we see in games like Symphony of the Night or Area of Sorrow.
It's all about personal preference.
Mm,
I guess I personally enjoyed the focused narrative and the emphasis on Leon's journey, but I can see why some fans might want a more intricate story with more lore.
right. And it's important to remember that Lament of Innocence was the first 3D Castlevania game to really dig into the series lore and try to create a more solid timeline. So it was a necessary step in the evolution of the franchise.
Totally. It's like this game paved the way for later titles to tell more complex stories and explore the Castlevania mythology in more depth.
Exactly. It laid a foundation that allowed the series to grow and experiment with new ideas while still staying true to its core themes and gothic atmosphere.
Okay, gotta ask, where does Lament of Innocence rank on your list of favorite Castlevania games?
That's a tough one. Castlevania has so many great games, each with its own unique strengths and weaknesses. I'd definitely put Lament of Innocence up there with the best of them.
What makes it stand out for you?
For me, it's the whole package. You've got this compelling origin story, a main character in Leon who's easy to like and relate to, and a genuinely tragic love story at the heart of it all.
It's definitely a game that stays with you.
Absolutely. And the game deserves credit for successfully bringing the classic Castlevania formula into 3D. It wasn't perfect, but it set a standard that not many later games in the series could match.
You've touched on this a bit, but I think it's worth exploring further. Lament of Innocence wasn't universally loved, but it definitely made an impact. What would you say are its biggest legacies within the Castlevania franchise?
That's a great question. I think one of the most important things is how it handled Dracula's origin story. Before Lament of Innocence, he was this almost mythical figure, this pure embodiment of evil. But this game gave him a human backstory, showed us his pain, his reasons for doing what he does.
So it made Dracula more human, made him more than just a monster to kill.
Exactly. And that approach, that willingness to explore the villain's mind, that's something you see in later Castlevania games. It adds complexity to the conflict, makes it more than just good versus evil.
Right, because it makes you, the player, question your assumptions about who the real monsters are.
Exactly. Another important legacy is how Lament of Innocence explored those themes of sacrifice and duty, especially within the Belmont family. Leon's choice to use Sarah's soul, that act of love and loss, it set a precedent for future Belmonts. It showed that this fight against darkness always comes with a price.
It's like this undercurrent of tragedy that runs through the whole series. As a player, you're constantly reminded that victory over evil often means personal loss.
Exactly, and I think that's something that really connects with players. It gives the story weight, makes it more than just a simple action adventure.
Okay, let's switch gears for a minute and talk about something a bit more technical. We've talked about the level design in Lament of Innocence and how it compares to the 2D Castlevania games. But I'm curious to hear what you think about the game's combat system. How does it hold up against other action games from that era?
Well, it definitely shows its age. Lament of Innocence came out in 2003, which was a time when developers were really experimenting with 3D action games, and you can see some of those influences in the combat.
Like what games come to mind when you play Lament of Innocence?
Well, there are definitely some elements of Devil May Cry in there, especially in how the game emphasizes stylish combos, juggling enemies in the air, and those satisfyingly powerful hits.
So it's not just about mashing buttons, there's skill involved.
Absolutely. You got to master Leon's moves, chain together your attacks, learn enemy patterns. It's all part of the fun.
Yeah.
And Lament of Innocence does it well.
And how does the whip feel in 3D? That's always been such an important part of the Castlevania experience.
It actually feels really good. The whip has weight and impact, and you can use it for a bunch of different attacks, from basic swings to charged up strikes that can send enemies flying.
So it's not just a simple melee weapon, it's a versatile tool that you can use to control the fight.
Exactly. And as you play through the game and upgrade the vampire killer, it gets new abilities, which adds even more depth to the combat.
So the combat system in Lament of Innocence is more than just mindless hacking and slashing. There's depth there.
Right.
You have to be strategic and skillful to really master it.
Definitely. And it's one of the things that makes this game great. Even though it's from a different era, the combat in Lament of Innocence holds up really well, and it's still fun to play today.
We've covered a lot of ground, but I feel like we're just getting started. There's so much more to talk about when it comes to Lament of Innocence, its impact on the series, its hidden depths, and its place in Castlevania history.
You're right. This game often gets overlooked, but it's a lot richer than people realize.
So stick with us, listeners. We're about to go even deeper into the world of Castlevania. Lament of Innocence. Okay, so we're back and ready to, I guess, wrap things up with Lament of Innocence. We've talked about pretty much everything, haven't we? Story, gameplay, that whole jump to 3D, all the secrets hidden in the castle. But there's one more thing I want to touch on. The visual style, the atmosphere of the game. I feel like that's such a big part of what makes Castlevania, Castlevania.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Lament of Innocence, it really nailed the visuals. And remember, this was back in 2003. The PS2, it was pushing the limits of what games could look like. The developers, they really wanted to create a world that felt, both gothic and epic at the same time.
I can imagine. So, help me picture it. I put the game in. What am I seeing? What are the visuals that really stick out?
Well, first of all, the castle itself, it's massive, imposing, huge walls, Gothic arches, tons of little details everywhere. Gargoyles looking down from the rooftops, stained glass windows showing all these dark, creepy scenes, flickering torches casting shadows everywhere.
So it really captures that classic Castlevania feel, right? The Gothic architecture, the sense of foreboding.
Oh, totally. And the environments inside the castle, they're amazing too. Each area, it's got its own look, its own style, and it kind of tells you something about the history of that place.
Right, you were talking about the House of Sacred Remains before and that Anti-Soul Mysteries lab.
Yeah.
Those are perfect examples. One's super somber and almost holy. The other's all industrial and scientific.
Exactly. The House of Sacred Remains, it's like a cathedral, but dedicated to darkness, High ceilings, stained glass, tombs everywhere. Totally different from the lab, with all those bookshelves and bubbling potions and weird machines.
Like the environments themselves are telling a story, giving you clues about the world.
They are. And then there are all these little details, the things that make it feel real, the way the dust moves in the light, how Leon's cape flows when he runs, the designs of the enemies. The developers, they thought about everything.
It's like they were trying to build a world that you could get lost in, not just through playing, but through the atmosphere, the way it looks.
Totally. And that's why I think Lament of Innocence still looks so good today. It wasn't just about fancy graphics. It was about creating a world that feels real, that you can believe in.
Okay, got to ask about the character designs too. We've talked about Leon and Matthias, but what about the other characters? Anyone really stand out?
Oh, for sure. Ronaldo, the alchemist who helps Leon out, he's got that classic wise old man look, long beard, robes, very Gandalf-esque.
I love it.
And then there's Joachim, remember the vampire who you can unlock and play as. He's got this whole Byronic thing going on, very stylish.
Brooding, probably with amazing hair. It's Castlevania. The guy have great hair.
Of course. And even the enemies, they're all visually unique. You've got your classic skeleton, sure, but then there are these, I don't even know how to describe them, like fleshy, gothic nightmares.
Sounds like a visual treat for horror fans.
Hmm.
Okay, so we've got the visuals down. What about the sound design? Does it match that gothic vibe?
Oh, absolutely. The sound design is amazing in Lament of Innocence. Everything from footsteps in the castle to the sounds the monsters make, it all creates this super immersive experience.
Give me some examples. What are some sounds that really stuck with you?
Honestly, one that always freaks me out is the succubus's laugh in the ghostly theater. It's this high-pitched giggle, almost like a child's, but it's so creepy.
Ugh, yeah. I could see why that would stick with you. But what about those more subtle sounds? The things that maybe you don't even really notice when you're playing, but they're still adding to the atmosphere.
Oh yeah, there are tons of those. The sound of the fireplaces crackling, the water dripping somewhere down in the dungeons, the floorboards creaking when you walk on them. It all adds to that sense of tension, that feeling like something's not quite right.
It's like they built this whole sonic world, just as detailed as the visuals. And then, of course, you've got the music.
Right, we talked about the music before. It's not like the most famous Castlevania soundtrack, but it's definitely good. It creates the right mood, you know. It's atmospheric, and there are some really cool tracks that get your heart pumping when the action starts.
Are there any specific tracks you think of when you're picturing Lament of Innocence, like the music that really captures the feel of the game?
Besides Leon's theme, which we both love, I really like the music in the Anti-Soul Mysteries Lab. It's got this creepy, almost industrial sound that fits perfectly with the weirdness of that place.
It's amazing how music can do that, right?
Yeah.
Take you right back to a specific moment in a game, make you feel those same emotions again.
It really is. Lament of Innocence, it uses music perfectly to draw you into the world and make you feel like you're really there.
Okay, I think we've covered it all. The story, the characters, the gameplay, the secrets, the visuals, the sound. We even talked about how the game was received when it came out and how it influenced the whole Castlevania series.
This has been a deep dive for sure, and I hope our listeners have learned something new about Lament of Innocence, a game that deserves more attention than it gets.
Absolutely. It might not be the most famous Castlevania game, but it's definitely one to remember. It took risks, it tried new things, and it really pushed the series forward.
It gave us a deeper look at Dracula, introduced ideas that would shape later games, and it brought that classic Castlevania action into the 3D world.
So if you haven't played Lament of Innocence yet, do yourself a favor and check it out.
Yeah, you might be surprised at how much you enjoy it.
That's it for this deep dive, everyone. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring those amazing worlds of video games.